Welcome to another Tuesday train with the 2MK team. This week is going to be a little quieter given what exactly the team is working on. Last week, we all learned some very small changes to character playstyle, and therefore testing them out and getting used to each other this week is the main aim. So I'll occasionally mention what is being worked on if you can't tell or the team doesn't end up discussing it, in case you weren't watching last week. But if you weren't watching last week, most of what you're seeing may just be how you figure these characters are supposed to be played. As usual, whenever the team gets a new set of toys, let's put it that way, overall cohesion in game plan improves, and we move a little bit closer toward at least looking like high-level players, even if we wouldn't be able to keep up with those players. The game itself also becomes more fun. And that is one of our primary goals in these Tuesday Train Lounges, to make sure that everyone understands enough about the game to choose how they want to play their character, which character they want to play, and enjoy the game as much as possible. So, in order to make that easier, whereas the team is normally listening for things to help them get over plateaus, things to help them understand what they're doing wrong so they can have more fun, we're at that stage in our training loop where people already know all those things and just need to physically do them and learn a bunch of things about what happens when they do them. This shift usually means that there's not a lot to say, except maybe to help people understand an interaction that just happened. Or anything that happens a bit too often and keeps on coming up. But expect to see some dropped executions, some misspaced or mistimed things. Unlike before, where it was more so people not knowing or having the tools, and therefore making mistakes based on that. You're more likely to see a lot more mistakes in executing the plan that one has than in game plan itself, meaning that I don't have a whole bunch of analysis to do this week. This may change if anyone joins us with an otherwise unfamiliar character, or something evolves or one of us finds that it's too difficult to deal with the other's newest toy or tactic. But for the most part, yes. I expect to see some newbie-ish execution errors with our newest execution. And less discussion about what a particular person should be doing. But as the trade-off, expect to see a bit more impressive play if you are one who watches our streams often. Even if only because, once again, everyone's going up a level or so, moving over some plateau or another. Get a little closer to having fun at Guilty Gear tournaments that are entered.
基本ができてない。ソルは一体何を教えていたんだ。もっとも
Generally, we're going to see more shifts in terms of approaches from Kai, and some shifts in terms of defenses from Sin. This matchup, however, will stay mostly the same. Especially as Sin manages a lot better with Baiken's pressure, regardless of whether or not she's using the mat, and often doesn't really need to approach her in a way that jump back to Tommy mat really improves the situation up. In fact, Baiken's jump back mat response doesn't do much against Sin in general, because if he believes that she will do it, he's one of the few characters who can be assured to hit her from really far away. Therefore, this match is again mostly about usage of meter at key moments to gain heavy advantages. Whether that be Roman cancelling things, or using your super to buy yourself time or space, or even blitzing to change certain things. So I expect a lot more focus on usage of meter in the matches between these two, and a lot more flashiness as a result. Against a regular zoning Axel, this map would be a lot less useful. In this situation, given the tendency of our close range Axel to stay in certain positions and aim forward, Viking benefits from being in the air a lot more. Even though she can be relatively heavily hurt for it, while burst is still available, and while she still has some good options for her heavier air moves, it becomes harder and harder for Axel to do anything about it, unless he absolutely expects it. As soon as he starts to expect Viking to be in the air, then she gains the ability to be on the ground again. Her many strong approaches, combined with the constant approach and therefore gain of meter, means that for her this is mostly a race to do enough damage before the inevitable situation of getting hit for trying results in her losing. Therefore, it doesn't really make much sense for Viking to be economical with her meter in this matchup when against this type of Axel. The more of it she can figure out how to use effectively, both regular meter and burst, the more her chances of actually winning it. When backed into a corner like that, which is funny to say given that Axel can literally back you into the corner from the other side of the screen, as you can see, the Roman cancel will sometimes give you a free in, and if you are more confident that your opponent will go straight for it, you can use Blitz at particular ranges to quick cancel through, but often you'll need to Roman cancel that even. So your only real reason for doing that is if you aren't sure if they're going to use a certain type of special. Our newcomer reminds me to note something I usually say but forgot this week. This is a loser stays on lobby on the US East Coast. We did not restrict any joining, as lag doesn't particularly bother us most of the time. So even if you're laggy, if you wish to stay, go ahead, unless it's unplayable. But do note that it's mostly a beginner to intermediate lobby, and as a result, is the losing player that stays on until they decide they're going to stop and take stock of the situation.
刃に乗せる思いは力。しかし、思いに乗せる刃は狂気に過ぎません。足かせのついた刀では、あなたの実力が陰るだけですよ。Once again, as you can see, the sort of thing is decided more so by the interactions afforded by meter. Even if the meter isn't used until the very end, being able to catch your opponent by forcing them to think about your super or blitz or something similar changes the matchup between these two players using these two characters, that is, quite a lot. Since both characters also build meter fairly quickly and do a lot of damage to each other. There are a lot of very key moments and clinch decisions that need to be made in very short spaces of time. Whether it be dead angle attacks, supers to buy yourself time, or blitzes when you're not sure what else to do. So, another close match. One of the other problems with Axel is that his spacing forces Baiken to not be able to land a lot of her lows once she gets in close. And without the threat of her lows, she also doesn't get to use standing dust as much. In order to get in on this flow of Axel, Baiken often needs to have multiple approach options available just to make Axel think about them, otherwise she's just going to run into the same thing. Nearly all Baiken's direct approaches are reactable. And Axel can do very small adjustments to spacing to deal with the rest. Therefore, she must take advantage whenever she's not been pushed all the way out, and save her meter to get in when she has been. Once meter is gone, you have to take a fairly heavy risk to finish it. Fortunately for Baiken, once she has gotten Axel under pressure and needs to retreat, the same jump back options apply, as his moves are too slow to catch her on the way back out without getting clipped by either the mat or the club. Another problem is the low meter gain gained from many of Baiken's actual approaches. Therefore making it harder for her to build meter without putting herself at risk. This often makes the Baiken player play linearly because once they have the meter, they're just going to use it, and Axel can expect this. And if anything, that would be the bigger reason why the blitz is occasionally important. As it will help prevent the Axel player from being able to expect you to do something every time. In order to move forward carefully and safely, you need the meter, which is an easy way to get tempted into trying to use it as soon as you have it. Well, let's hope Space Wolf's internet holds out today, lag-wise that is. On both sides, given that it's super difficult to stop Leo when you are laggy, slow down or not. So far no carryover signs of lag at least. But I guess we'll find out. As for this matchup, Leo can get in on Axel quite easily once he really wants to. But similar to Baiken, there's a lot of damage Axel ends up taking while trying to fix this without using either his dead angle or his counter. It's actually easier for Axel to win this match more so by staying out of the way and using his new cancelable crouch heavy. Having too many expectations of what Leo will do can make it very difficult for you to recover in time to get away from him. Invincible moves help quite a lot with this.
That match is a particularly good example of something that happens in fighting games when you get close to the timer running out. Often, your character has some moves that are not very rewarding and very unlikely to actually open your opponent up. But are good at keeping them from counterattacking you and allow you to retreat to a safe position. If you have the life lead, especially a considerable one, and are getting close to the end of a match, and for some reason you don't want to try to lame it out, for some reason you believe your opponent might be able to sneak in, get in on you, or you just don't want them moving because of the sort of player they are, you have some fairly strong options once you start using those moves again. For the most part, your opponent cannot just respond to them, or they may end up using a lot of meter or similar to defend themselves against you. This being disadvantageous to them though, because as it becomes more and more difficult to do, they in turn have more and more trouble finishing you off before the time runs out. Every second that you spend doing a move that they have trouble punishing is 1 second closer to winning the match, even if that move does no damage and wouldn't have opened them up anyway. A similar approach can be taken when you have a character who has a lot of really good defensive options, such as Axel or Sin, and you're playing in mid-range even at the middle of a match. Once you have the life lead, and you know you can consistently do safe moves to basically buy even more time, you can get a lot of benefit out of this. And both Axel and Sin signal fairly heavily to you when you're overcommitting yourself. Sin runs out of food, and Axel runs out of meter. So you have to ask yourself, why am I trying to get in the first place? Most of the time you're just losing health to do it. Or rather, why are you trying to open your opponent up? You could certainly try to get in, just use the safest way possible. It has the lowest chance of actually succeeding at opening them up, but you don't care. Furthermore, since it prevents the opponent from taking certain actions of their own, you might have a move that does that, for example, really well. You can save yourself a lot of trouble about worrying about their approaches simply by doing one just so they don't come at you. Similarly, doing certain moves may tempt the opponent into either being frustrated because they can't do anything, or if you really commit to it, bait them into thinking that it's time to move, based on the perception that they might be able to beat you by sticking out moves beforehand. This is a harder technique because you obviously would then have to learn to whiff punish their stuff, but it's not a terrible practice. So, you should focus and try to figure out why exactly you're trying to get in or open your opponent up in the way you are in situations where you're playing this sort of character who doesn't really need to and who intercepts the opponent well. Interestingly, Baiken can also be played this way for many matchups, but not all. Whereas Sin and Atsu can play almost any matchup that way. Baiken has to worry more about whether or not the opponent has good vectors to attack that space she occupies when she jumps with the mat. If they do not, however, she can play more or less the same way. She cannot do this against Sin because he absolutely can hit that space without much effort, in fact. However, given a few of her other options, it's not a terrible plan to do it for short periods. Especially if she does it more so by staying on the ground and only going into the air when she has a good feeling. Sin, in turn, can use his vault to get in on Baiken, which is something he can't really do with Axel or the others. Because while she does have upward attacks, she can't risk just throwing them out most of the time, as Sin has other really good approach options and long range. In fact, one of Sin's strongest approaches against Baiken is simply to vault when he sees her try an approach, because she will generally not be able to stop herself and launch a counter vault attack in time. Since so many of her aerial attacks are meant to go downward, being in the air at the same height as Baiken can be an effective countermeasure. And Sin is in no way lacking in moves that will allow him to do decent damage to Baiken from there. In fact, they decently have good range as well. He can even use a few of them when he's just expecting her to try to respond to his vault, rather than actually going all the way in with the jumping attack. But as noted at the start of stream, you're going to see a lot more execution drops as everyone gets used to focusing on using moves in new situations. Once again, you see the relatively heavy requirement of meter in this matchup, even with a different style of Viking. This is similar to the other Viking that we're more used to with the very measured spacing. But that style of interaction really doesn't change too much. However, the mat is still a really effective approach tool in those particular positions. Scene does have an invincible move to stand up to it, but it depends on the spacing, as the Hot Baker will not actually hit Baiken if she spaces the mat correctly. Note, however, that if you do misspace the forward mat, or use it after certain knockdowns, Scene absolutely can still wake up with Hot Baker and you will be pushed off at least, if not hit. This is because Hot Baker is actually 9 frames of startup and invincible for all 9 of those frames. It does, however, have very few active frames and a small hitbox, so it's more so that you're landing in it than anything else. Therefore, if you feel as if you've misspaced your mat, you can Roman cancel it and still be safe. Against Slayer, Sin needs his meter more for the dead angle attack, for those situations in which Slayer will not allow the throw. Faultless Defense is also useful in pushing him back off to where Sin can hit his various standing, slash, and similar, just to keep Slayer in position. This is a lot more about being able to make sure that once Slayer does get pressure started, that Sin can get out of it. As this forces Slayer to make a lot more rough decisions. And work a lot more to continually try to get in more and more. This work gives Sin the damage to pay Slayer back for anything that happened while pressure was going on. The rest is just measuring space to tell when Slayer has overcommitted and spacing was incorrect at the time. Slayer similarly can use his dash and his Roman cancels to resolve a lot of those situations by simply watching for the marker of the green block. Similarly, if he has enough confidence to believe that he will be able to land the crouch heavy, i.e. the bat, after seeing the green block, it is a good option, as Scene will be too far away for anything much to happen. This mostly only works well in the corner though, because otherwise Scene can vault or jump out, just having done that. Leaving him with more options after managing to defend with the FD. Similarly, any movement from Slayer prior to the move will generally give Scene a good spacing to do things. So the Sin player is focused on controlling the space that is created when Slayer impacts with him. And Slayer is focused on watching that space created and deciding what to do next from there. He doesn't really need to stop the pressure at all. He just has to change it based on where he thinks scene is going to be and watching really carefully based on where he gets pushed to. Slayer has a lot of good pursuit on Kai, Kai being one of the characters that cannot necessarily backdash away from Slayer even at certain really good spacings. It's not necessarily the distance of Kai's backdash that's the problem, but rather how quickly he gets out of the way. Whereas by contrast, Sin can get out whenever he wants, Jam and to some extent Ino can get out most of the time, and so on. Kai's defensive abilities have more to do with perfectly spacing himself or using invincible moves. Slayer seldom suffers if Kai attempts some other method of getting out of it, but he does sometimes suffer if Kai simply blocks and he goes for the chase too quickly, as this puts him in Kai's control range. When we say control range, we refer to the point where your opponent can do whatever block string they feel like and you will end up where they want you to. This means that even if your move is safe, if you ended up in your opponent's control range, you may still be at certain disadvantages based on this. Especially if the matchup does not favor your character's options versus the particular opponent. Kai's relatively poor offense and Slayer's stronger defensive spacing also make this difficult if Kai can never get into his control space. Therefore, Slayer being able to keep Kai out of that space or never enter it himself just makes the offense side of the game difficult for Kai. If Slayer gets the life lead and then continues to play in that way, Kai has to take a lot more risks.
we see here regarding the Roman cancelled projectile from Kai does have a weakness against characters with invincible moves or good counters. Specifically, the fact that Kai can do this at the very last moment, but if he's not spaced correctly, there's just enough time to either green block the projectile and then do your invincible move, or if you realize you don't need to green block it and Kai is too far away, just do the invincible move immediately. The fact that you have both of these options usually means that Kai can only afford to do this against certain characters or from very specific ranges. However, notably, if your character's invincible move has a very small hitbox, you do have to be very on point with it, and Kai can in turn bait you or give you other stresses relative to it. Overall though, if you are good at keeping your opponent out, you should still be able to react in time most of the time, especially since Kai normally must go for a low at that point. Most counters and invincible moves start quickly enough that Kai will not be able to land this low without risking quite a lot. At closer spacings, he can get into position in time, but when a bit further out, and you should be able to recognize this, because you can recognize it from the moment that Kai actually does the Roman cancel itself, you should be able to recognize whether or not you have this reaction. Baiken also gains another good option in that she can move forward very slightly and then use her claw to whiff punish anything Axel slips out. But it does normally require a dash, as Axel has no reason to react otherwise, and it normally is only a full screen thing when she otherwise would have no positioning. However, it does help in that even if she does not actually do anything after that dash, due to Axel not reacting, for example, now she is in the better position where all of her other approachings do work, including her Roman cancel jumps. The key from the Axel side, therefore, is, as you've just seen, when Baiken's spacing is ambiguous but you don't expect that they feel confident enough to attack, ready that move so that by the time they actually decide to do anything, you have a full screen multi-directional attack ready to keep them out. Baiken can get around this, but usually not from full screen and not without some meter usage. Once this has changed enough that Axel no longer feels comfortable just
poking buttons to keep biking out, the rest of her game plan unlocks again, and she is able to use her mat at long range, just for regular hits actually. She can do it either on the ground or in the air because the opponent can no longer just decide to take an action. Once given enough of this space control, all she has to do is recognize a full screen situation and not immediately panic or use it to push through. As this is generally what Axel will be waiting and watching for, and after a full screen separation of any kind, there's really nothing else for Axel to be focused on mentally in the first place. Therefore, it is necessary to make Axel start to think about something else or perceive a change in situation before attempting another approach, as a simple dash, jump, Roman cancel will usually fail.
Similar to Xin, Baiken often needs in this matchup to use her green block to push Slayer back out so that she can control the situation. The difference is that Baiken has a much clearer idea of when Slayer will be doing moves that need to be blocked like that in the first place. Whereas Xin has a lot more situations where it is ambiguous and he has some options for defense first. Once this is done, Baiken can normally get by with just mat from the air in particular situations or hard counters. As Slayer finds it difficult to approach her once she has gotten him to those positions. The meter will handle the rest along with some throws. Slayer in turn has to have the same response as against Xin, watching for when the green block or a disadvantageous spacing has happened, and deciding if to continue the attack, and if so, with what. And once again we see the situation mentioned before. Baiken has the life lead and does not specifically need to approach Axel, and if she should approach him, she can do it in one of her safer methods, which is usually her better option at this point. To make him think she's approaching and then just not bother, or to use a very safe option to do it so that she doesn't have to worry about actually taking any damage. This eventually will wear out the Axel player without them actually getting much benefit. Because you should always expect that your opponent will have something ready for whatever big risk you take, especially when using a Roman cancel as your method of approaching. Because, as mentioned in the case with Kai, as soon as your opponent sees you Roman cancel, they are then able to measure distances just as you can. If you are too far away and were not counting on it to trick them in some other way, you can't use it to mess with your opponent's reactions most of the time unless you Roman cancelled at the very last moment and they had already reacted. In that situation, for example, the opponent has already reacted and you're using the Roman cancel to see what it is that they have done so that you can decide how to deal with it. However, you cannot just use it to get in against most people, except in certain spaces, because they will be watching for when you have done the Roman cancel and measured their response to anything you probably should do from there. Mix-up characters have a much better chance of doing this job than others but you're still going to have some stress. In this situation, for example, Baiken has the life lead, but would then need to be the one waiting for the perfect response. Becoming entirely defensive is just as linear a problem, as she doesn't have a lot of really good responses of her own. Therefore, it would have been better in her situation to make the safest attack she could think of to buy the last 4 seconds. All of these little things do need to be trained in order for you to improve fully. One good example of that is that in this matchup, if Slayer becomes defensive, Baiken has control of the space because Baiken's control space is effectively infinite. There is no space on the screen that you can occupy that, without a strong reaction, you can make it so that Baiken can't put you where she wants. This means that with this level of advantage, Baiken can always take full control of the situation as long as she doesn't attempt a very rapid attack that you're expecting. When her buttons whiff, Slayer does not really have responses to deal with that. But playing defensively is not really what we're talking about either. This is for the situation where Slayer is now on defense, and Baiken uses that time to reposition herself so that she then has control. Which is a very different flow than defending, because then Slayer will override her control space with his own. Relatively easily most of the time too. Baiken in turn has a lot of reasons to challenge with buttons, but not a lot of reasons to attack. As you can see there, Slayer can't do much about that. Even with his meters, he can't necessarily do a whole lot about being pulled in with the claw and blocking. But if Baiken is overzealous and attacks anyway after that, she enters Slayer's control space very heavily, and he gains immediate advantage. As with most of Just Fine's characters, mental control is a lot more important than either execution or punishability. Fortunately, such characters often have decently strong damage to make up for those moments where the opponent has managed to get an advantage against your mental state, giving you enough time to reset it and relax a bit while you sit on the life lead. Learning to relax while playing this sort of character is paramount when you're not facing rushdown characters yourself. When you're facing rushdown, most of the time you can keep attacking them because they want to hit more buttons. And rushdown characters have much smaller control spaces than Baiken, as does nearly everyone. Leading to her having decent advantage in those situations that she does not have quite so strongly against characters like Axel. As you've noted there, she also has good whiff punish buttons for a lot of things, so this is what contributes to that huge control space she has. Because it includes causing the opponent to whiff on expectation of her approach and punishing that whiff. But you still have that situation where she's at full screen and still goes for the same approach, leaving advantage to Axel. So if you're going to play Baiken, especially against characters like this, you must be very, very clear about what your control space is and when you don't need to attack because you have so much of an advantage in it. Note that those situations you've just seen, where the opponent has just hit you with a particular move, should be treated the same as a full screen knockback. Because again, your opponent knows exactly where you are and is already primed for whatever their response to your next movement should be. This is often why players talk about needing to move after being knocked out again, or needing to find the space to move just for that purpose. By contrast, once Baiken has landed an attack, she often does not have a proper control space against many characters anymore. Therefore, continuing her offense immediately is often not in her favor, except if you have the correct knockdown for the meaty or are willing to do some stuff that you expect your opponent to block. She does have meaty knockdown Oki off certain things, but she's not a character built around it as a generality. As she tends to push the opponent back out fairly quickly if they just block, and loses a lot of her reactability if they green block. Meaning that she must take her control space after a knockdown or a hit at the mid-levels more so than going for more offense. To simplify this, Just consider where you want to be after a knockdown with Baiken, rather than going for another attack immediately, as most of the time your attack will be countered. Once you've learned enough about the specifics of Mat and one other knockdown, you can then start to do things relative to that. But for most of these stray hit style interactions you have mid-screen, even though she converts well, she can't then be assured that her ulti will be good. While the team does have some general familiarity with the Sol matchup, it tends to be more so toward neutral Sol, and we're seeing a lot more pressure here. So, let's see what they end up doing. One of your strongest options against heavy pressure of this particular kind is again your invincible reversal or even just straight bursting on wake up. This is punishable by a lot of things, but when your opponent is particularly close to you, depending on what exactly their pressure is, you can often get away with it one way or another. But of course, since you only get one chance at this, you generally only care about it when you expect that you won't be able to hold the opponent off, or to try to keep the life deficit as small as possible, meaning that you don't have to deal with life lead problems. In general, when fighting against Axel, you should remember to check your character's jump height, as this often affects how effective you are against him, both on their normal and double jumps. This is not in the sense that you want to stay out of his range, but rather the opposite. A shorter jump will often mean you can land quicker and therefore don't have to deal with some of his stuff. A higher jump often needs to be combined with more trickery or meter usage to slip in through Axel's attacks. The concept of control space between these two characters exists a bit less, so to speak, because of their ability to move out of the way of the other's attacks so quickly. Slayer can dash through many of Axel's moves altogether, and Axel has at least two ways of going over Slayer's attacks at long range, causing him to completely avoid most of Slayer's more pressuring lows. Additional invincibility on various positions on both sides helps to keep the concept of control space a lot more limited than for, say, Viking. And there you see Kai's other option in situations where he would normally backdash coming into play in this matchup. Instant Air Grinder will put Kai back on the ground quite quickly, while still generally, if executed perfectly, stopping a lot of Slayer's attacks and evading Slayer's lows. This is not necessarily a safe or great option, but it is in general situations better than trying to backdash. It also allows Kai to get his offense started again a lot better than any other options in that space. The relative difficulty of the execution, of course, compared to a simple backdash, means that it's more of a higher level technique to do, but once you've reached the point where that is the deciding factor in your match, obviously the only thing to do is move on to that point. In this case, the straight-up Sol matchup is dealt with primarily by those two things you've seen so far. Slayer has a lot of good options with his standing kick, as you've seen there. And once Sol has left that space, dashing on reaction will evade a lot of things, as will the Dandy Step's invincibility. Meaning that Sol really doesn't have a lot of great options at that spacing, as long as your reactions are fast enough to get out of the way of his attacks. Whether or not you choose to dash or go for the invincibility has more to do with your expectations of the opponent, as they can, as just seen, come in from the ground and move in such a way that your dash becomes less powerful. However, your invincibility does not change too much, therefore you're usually safe to do so. Slayer can also backdash out of a lot of situations that Sol would otherwise get advantage in if he has the space to do it. So this is a very reaction-heavy matchup when Sol is playing in the pressure or full space wave. So overall, consider the question of this match: can you react fast enough to annoy Sol enough to win? As a lot of his options really don't touch a dashing Slayer at all, but Slayer is always dashing. Once you are knocked down, there will be problems, obviously. However, Slayer is normally able to hold on to his burst fairly deep into this matchup, and often builds up enough meter to block his wake up with his green block and push Sol back up to a position he's more comfortable with. Once cornered, the situation generally devolves, and Slayer's aim is to avoid getting cornered by using those rotations and pressing in whenever he can to get some pushback on Sol, as Sol does not usually have the range to escape from Slayer's pressure, but he will usually block it all. You can see the contrast here, where Slayer builds more in both cases by trying to move and keep the attack up on the lows, and does not necessarily gain as much from backdashing out of Ino's buttons, as he has to then come back in. Often he has to backdash when she attempts to punish with Chemical Love to make sure that he immediately can move back in again with an attack. It is not a footsie tool anymore, nor a reaction, but rather just a thing he does at the end of a pressure string of his own, to prevent her from being able to use her footsies against him, basically. Ino also has a large control space, but as long as Slayer is the one striking and knows when to give it up and backdash, generally she has trouble holding on to it for very long against him.
した内容だがオードブルでは満足できなくてね。スレイヤー勝ちだ。ストレート。そのような小芝居を打たずとも私は本当
As noted before, what you've just seen is actually a double adaptation based on playing each other often enough. Our Ino player knows that even if Kai blocks the standing dust in a particular situation, she hasn't given up control space. The situation is still in her favor. However, if she attacks or stays in the position too long, our Kai player knows that you can just do Read Sever immediately, and it will catch most things Ino can do. So the question is, how long does one want to stand there? Neither player is directly at disadvantage by this interaction happening, at least not at their current level. So they don't have any reason to stop doing either of those things, really. It just becomes a part of the interactions that they tend to have. If they meet another stronger player who has a solution every time, and that solution can't be beaten, then it will obviously get incorporated back. Similarly, as you can see there, Kai has things that can be done, especially with meter, if Ino does things in an attempt to get out of the way of the Greed 7. So a well-known adaptation on both sides. The main deciding factor then becomes the final point of both the dead angle attack and meter usage to deal with ways out of that mix-up or ways out of that interaction that are not the standard. If you have no meter though, there's really no reason to worry about it. You're both still probably in a convenient and comfortable situation. This is partially why meter watching at higher levels is so important. Many of the final interactions, the ones where both players know all of the paths, are decided by how much meter one can afford to spend and how likely one is to try to finally use that metered option to get out of these things. If you fail to watch your opponent's meter correctly, you may think you are in the standard situation and then get hit, possibly with quite a lot of damage. Another similar interaction that is again decided almost entirely by meter. Had Ino used hers earlier, she would have most likely been the victorious one. However, until Kai was willing and ready to use his, or take a big risk, he had no way of making Ino feel unsafe either. Both players therefore were found in that moment of, should I be the first to try to use the meter, knowing that the opponent could easily use their meter to counter it. Ino chose not to, and Kai chose to do so in the end. Ino's capacity to deal with Saul's attacks from long range is a little different in that she can stop him from starting them entirely, but if she gets this wrong and gets blocked, or evaded like that, she tends to take a lot of damage. So this is, as you'd expect from a musical character, understanding of the rhythm of the opponent and what you do with it and when you actually take their attacks and when you don't. Much like other characters, therefore, she doesn't really need a lot of meter in the neutral in this match, and therefore can use it to deal with the wake-up pressure. The key, therefore, to earn enough meter before you get taken down to make it so you don't have to worry about it at all. Her decent footsies also make it easier to deal with him, but she does have to backdash out of some things after taking the hits, given that her moves are too slow to combo in ways that will bother Soul a lot. In other words, if you choose not to FD to defend against his push and manage to get some hits, you should try to backdash out of those hits so that you don't have to worry about stuff afterwards. But if you do choose to FD, most of the time she has something that will help her counter. As you can see, Saul gets pushed way too far out to really continue his pressure on her without a lot of his own meter or a heavy commitment. Her very precise control of the note versus Gunflame is also useful here, as it just extends the amount of control she has over the situation quite heavily. Other characters with less versatile zoning tools generally cannot keep Saul out quite as well, as he will eventually find a way around it or blitz or something. But as you noted, she did need to do this to start with, as in Guilty Gear you don't get very much meter without attacking. She needed enough to make sure that if she did decide to wake up FD, then she'd be okay. Because you don't have to wake up with the FD, you have to have the option for it, which changes how Saul must approach his pressure. You also need, to some extent, to be able to do it when you're cornered, because she doesn't have as many good options then. After a while, one gets more and more used to Saul's pressure, and it becomes a question of how often you can push him back out to a point where you have control space. Fortunately for Ino, she has control space most of the time against Saul, and therefore he has to make some relatively hard reads once pushed out, even if he does deplete all her meter with his pressure, to make sure that he can get back in before she gets any more. In this matchup, Ino can delay her FD quite a lot and not rely on it. The green block is simply not required when Slayer uses certain pressure strings. She can gain control space without it, and usually enough meter to do whatever she wants. As Slayer does not have a good general attack vector toward Ino's aerial positions, he is easier to mix up than most characters in those regards. Most of the options are similar to how he has to deal with Saul, i.e. dash out of the way entirely, rather than even trying to deal with him. In other words, once Slayer sees Ino jump or dash, Slayer's response should generally be to dash. However, once Ino has enough meter, she can punish this as well, and you therefore have a very strong dynamic about making sure that she blocks enough to not have too much, while not overworking yourself, and watching your meter when she starts approaching. Once you have reached the point of the match where she does have meter, you may need to do some dandy step shenanigans to get out of her air pressure. And even that may not save you depending on the height she went to and the timing. So, you should generally save it for very well-known situations so that you don't have to deal with uncertainty in others, until you've learned more of them anyway. Fortunately, playing defensively against Ino is relatively strong for Slayer once he has the life lead, and once he gets it, it's more than enough to just try to hold on to it for a while, as she will often leave herself open to another big set of hits while trying to get in. But you do have to be on point to deliver those hits, so don't expect this to be something you can use as a beginner tactic, a first order tactic in that matchup. Still, if you're facing an Ino that knows how to put you in those positions, and you have no other training partner, you're going to have to learn it, so it's not terrible to try. If your reactions are fast enough, and you can do the long dash, you can also avoid her instant air heavy slash. But this is less of a threat in general, given that her doing super at that height is normally not that big a deal to you, given that you probably didn't do anything but block. So unless you are facing the combo breaker Guilty Gear champion, I doubt you need to worry about it a lot. And victory by literal chip timeout. when mid-screen with enough health, Slayer absolutely can wake up backdash against the charged stun dipper. You will get hit, but the benefit it gives the Kai can be reduced by you going backward in the first place, whereas just blocking it can lead to a lot of pressure from offensively minded Kai players. Similarly, if you're absolutely sure it's coming and you have really good reactions, depending on the range and which knockdown got you there, you can in fact dandy step through the entire thing. But again, this relies very heavily on which knockdown and therefore how far away Kai was when he did it. Fortunately for you, on most knockdowns, Kai must do the move immediately, leaving less ambiguity as to whether or not it's a good idea. You just have to know which move to do it on. And if you're not confident, backdash. If you realize that your backdash occasionally doesn't get hit at all, then you can use that to make a decision. Get used to that knockdown where your backdash does not get hit, and time the dandy step accordingly. Unfortunately, I do not offhand remember which of the dandy steps you're supposed to use for this, and I'm pretty sure that Kai can still block them both. But it does prevent you from having to deal with it if you really are sure that your opponent is using this for pressure and will almost always try to go in. Well, while it isn't our usual Johnny, we do have Johnny to discuss. A lot of the issue with Johnny's offense and why Kai can control him is based on the fact that unlike many characters in this game, Johnny's dashes are neither invincible nor particularly good in the direct sense. In short, once Johnny dashes, you have a good idea where he's going to end up. And he can only basically usually dash again. Characters who can run have different potential here. You don't have the same ability to measure where they're going to end up on the screen as you have with Johnny. And is one of his few weaknesses, if you can call it one. Of course, once Johnny does manage to hit you, the situation shifts drastically, and he can use a lot of good options with his generally other approach tools, and as we've seen from our usual Johnny, Red Roman cancel dashes. But until he has those available to him, you don't have to fear that much when his mobility is your problem, because you can just get used to the idea that he can't actually do that much spatially to confuse you. Make sure that you are on point with your own spacing and know how to respond when his spacing is off in any way, or you have advantage somewhere. And again, therefore it comes down to watching your own control space very well and using your dead angle attack or FD depending on which one you need when under too much pressure and expecting to have more problems. You can of course do this and use your meter for big damage to get the life lead back if you expect that you can defend out. It depends a lot on your character. Very good defensive options generally implies that you can use some meter to keep the life lead or even just get it, because you don't have to worry about taking a lot of damage from Johnny too often. In other words, his difficulty with getting in would generally mean that you're safe. However, if your character's defensive options are not quite as good as Kai's, you should generally not use your meter too much, as you will often need it for your actual defense.
心、運、そして時。駆け引きの機微に悟ければ、技量の差は意味を築かれます。終始あなたの
Ino has a similar strength against Johnny in that once she is at a particular space, his dashing ability means that he can't really hurt her other than by doing some very specific moves. Most of the time, therefore, Ino's aim is to make sure she understands where Johnny is headed more so than where he is. Though this is not a matter of just reading and guessing, this is a matter of putting herself in positions where Johnny only has one approach at a time. For example, right there, she did not actually move after knocking him down with Chemical Love. But at that point, she was too close to have advantage on that position. You have to pay a lot of attention on Ino to, if you do get a knockdown or another hit, how far away you ended up from Johnny and how you can put him someplace where he only has one attack available. Once he only has one attack, his general limitations with dashing and so on give him more stress. But as you can see there, Johnny is still a threat as long as he has enough meter, and Ino must therefore either use hers to do damage or find a way to defend against his options before he gets an entirely new one. Another good option, of course, is just having a really huge life lead so that even if he hits you, it doesn't matter. But most of the time, you end up using your meter to get even that life lead, making it somewhat difficult to keep up with him without thinking very carefully about how to use your meter to push him into positions that you want him in. But we managed to force the whiff this time. But here you see again, Ino can keep Johnny at his face where he really only has one option. It's not that his option is terrible, it's that it's reactable for her. But once he enters this space, he gains more options, and she has to use meter and escape tools to try to limit them again.
だ終わっていないようだ。
スレイヤー勝ちだ。デュエル2、様子見してんなよ。
As mentioned before, and just to explain it as a general thing, you see the difficulty in the execution of the instant air super from Ino, making it difficult to take certain approaches to this matchup. Different people do their instant air supers in different ways, but one strong suggestion I have for players of Ino specifically is that if you are familiar with the TK style input, that the fastest possible instant air super you can do in this game is to do the first half of the input as a TK style and do the second half normally, and that should give you what you need for most execution. Your problem will be more so those moments where you happen to not go into the air because of not pressing the jump direction quickly enough. But other than that, it's really not that difficult because it almost works most of the time, and the worst that will normally happen is that you'll get a random instant air dash or something instead. This is specific to this game. There are some other games with stricter versions of the instant air super. But all characters in Guilty Gear can mostly do theirs as the down to forward up, i.e. 2 to 9, 2 3 6 9, 2 3 6 if it is a forward super, and so on. If anything, the hardest part will be getting yourself to not hit the button until the end. But even if you do that, most of the time, once again, you'll just end up with a TK something, which might not be remotely what you want, but at least will randomly win a couple of times. Always remember that when your opponent does not know what you are trying to do, and it doesn't just instantly lose to their options, they will at least be more wary even if you intended to do something else much better. They'll at least have to think about it, and it will cut off something randomly anyway. Of course, the wake-up version of this is much harder, as you must time the first input such that the TK works at the moment you could actually leave the ground. Normally you do have to technically do this anyway, but you could, with certain other forms of execution, get away with it a little bit easier if you didn't try to do it that specific way.
Well, the problem as described isn't actually that odd, because as mentioned, it's usually more so managing to hit the button in the right timing, or getting too nervous about being able to hit the button in the right timing and therefore messing up the motion. They're both generally symptoms of the same difficulty. The feeling that one must do a particular thing very quickly, leading to mistiming one or more parts of it, because that part has to be slower in some deliberate way. We're back to this semi-requested matchup as well. Faust's pressure is similar to Sol, but with the fact that Faust can beat you up from the other side of the screen if he really wants to. The main key that you have to understand is whether or not your character must respect items or specifically choose to disrespect items. The randomness after that point is not up to Faust or you, and you just have to deal with it. But overall, understand that much if nothing else. When Faust puts out an item, you have to choose to either try to go forward, through it, or under it at him, because you choose disrespect, or you try to go backward and buy yourself space if you have it, i.e. choose to respect. Generally, characters with invincible reversals can respect Faust items, rush down characters, or characters with stronger zoning tools, interestingly, often have to disrespect Faust items. This is because Faust items control space for him, and when he makes enough control space, given his own long range, your range no longer matters. The character being such a good zoner is based heavily on how much respect you tend to pay and how much you are willing to let him get away with certain things out of either fear or just not having an invincible option to deal with him or evade his attack vectors. If you spend too much time trying to hit Faust, you will eventually get hurt. And, obviously, as just demonstrated, there are items you will not get away from in either of those choices. If you choose to generally disrespect Faust, there's a set of items that will make your life miserable. And if you choose to generally respect Faust, there is generally a different set of items that makes your life miserable. That said, you can't usually just guess which one it's going to be, or assume that Faust has certain plans based on what he expects it to be, as mostly this isn't really something he controls. So, accept at least some of the randomness involved in this, and commit to whatever you either find more fun or your character is better suited to. Kai has enough ability to cover Faust's attack vectors and directions cleanly that again, you are free to choose respect. You are free to block when you see Faust items, or dash out of the way, or instant air grinder depending on what they are and where you expect them to be. Air grinder will in turn keep you in positions where Faust doesn't get a lot of advantage, as well as setting up things that help you keep him away from you. This is similar to the Jackal matchup in that you have to have the patience to understand that you can't always win out, and just aim to win by being consistent and recognizing your opportunities, or rather, converting well off your opportunities, because that's what you're really aiming for most of the time. You more so want that when you consistently either respect or disrespect Faust's options, that you are aware enough of what is happening on screen to convert into big damage so you can win, more so than having to care about whether or not the option itself was good. And in the end, if necessary, you can always win like that. Slayer, on the other hand, tends to lack the vectors required to really annoy Faust from far enough away. He needs a lot of meter and a lot of patience to do this. If you're not that sort of player, Slayer's long forward dash is probably one of your better options relative to item usage. But generally, you can defend most of the rest of the time, which is interesting. Dandy Step is also an option, but will fail against more items than just dashing. So generally, upon seeing items being thrown at you, just dash forward. The rest of the matchup plays out as you'd mostly expect, except you have to guard low a lot more often. Since Slayer does not have the options that Ino or Kai has with instant air attack moves, and often must be on the ground in order to keep up his attacks, you're not going to get a lot out of this. Meaning it's harder to hold on to the life lead and not get beaten up if he happens to get good items. Fortunately, Faust tends to enter Slayer's control space fairly easily, and he does take a relatively large amount of damage. Once Slayer has slipped through and gotten into control space, Faust has few real options that can't be beaten by a bunch of weird Slayer stuff. But his strong options are extremely strong and tend to win most of the time, meaning that you have to eventually expect that you're going to be pushed off, and you may take quite a lot of damage in the process if you happen to have either a bad item that follows it up, or a very good Faust player who knows exactly where they're going to put you. However, at the mid-level, since the opponent has to be able to recognize all of Slayer's effective strikes and the ranges they're from, it can be a little difficult for them to consistently convert into big damage from them. Faust in this matchup is about a lot of conversions and a lot of very strong understanding of where the opponent is spending their time. Understanding where your opponent is spending their time in this matchup allows you to know which of your items, when you see them, are actually advantageous to you or not. Those items that make your opponent defensive and want to block allow you to open them up with Faust's relatively long-range buttons or overhead and prevent you from getting pushed back on their attacks. Those who attempt to avoid the overhead by walking away directly tend to respace themselves to positions where Faust is comfortable. Ino's issue with Faust is that she has to stay at a very specific space on screen. She can keep him from causing her a lot of trouble because she also controls almost all those spaces. But if she's not in a very specific spot on the screen, Faust can evade a lot of her attacks and quickly counterattack. If she attacks too much, he can use his long-range buttons to poke at her and be generally annoying. Therefore, it is possible for him to use items to cover his own movement, not necessarily to start a direct attack, but simply to get into that exact space where Ino no longer has advantage. He can also use that diving drill, as you've seen, to do it somewhat raw when he feels like it. This means he gets a lot more freedom for throwing out items until he gets a good one against her. And she is not one of those characters who often benefits too much from attempting to disrespect his items, as her dash and longer range attacks will cause him to get hit but for very small damage, and the item will generally continue to interact with her. This is further compounded by the fact that a lot of the time she can't afford to block low for very long in this matchup, and can get caught by Faust lows while trying to reposition herself or get ready for things. It's a lot of being ready for things, while Faust basically makes your life miserable with items. You are forced to play very defensively, and that defensive playstyle means that Faust gets to use more of his weird options, which you must then still react to, even though the situation looks as if you should have advantage. Fortunately for Ino, Faust spends a lot more meter to hurt her than she spends to hurt him. Leaving her with many options, blitz, and occasionally super to deal with when he actually tries to approach. This does not, however, help against good items, and she's one of the characters who suffers the most when placed into situations like that. In short, Faust gets to keep throwing items until he gets a good one, and then do massive damage from it. Whereas Ino must play defensively and stay on point the entire time, so as not to get taken by surprise by pretty much anything. can be a very tense matchup on both sides. In Faust's case, just basically praying for an item that lets him get some advantage, and in Ino's case, being ready to react to all the shenanigans Faust is using to make her stay defensive enough that he can keep on throwing items for that purpose. Once again, my suggestion to the spectators here is to watch the meters very carefully. Not only do you have the option to watch it a bit more carefully than the players are probably able, it will often help inform you as to what is probably about to happen in the round. As you've just potentially seen with the same super. When both meters are full, it does become fairly wildcardish what exactly will finish the match. Both because players are going to be less able to focus on the normal options of their opponent due to having to think on more things. And because, obviously, one can only build experience with opponent supers and similar attacks so often. There is a certain amount of time that you can spend learning what supers do in particular situations simply because they happen less often. In most games, you'll get 1 or 2 interactions regarding a super in any given round, if that. And a lot of the time those interactions involve someone getting hit or it being comboed. In Guilty Gear, which has a lot more uses for meter than most games, other than just EX combo extenders, I mean, you may never see any supers at all, further limiting what you can learn about your opponent's super moves. This applies to the players as well, of course. You can absolutely just go grind in training mode as to how and where your super hits, but with other moves having strange hitboxes, invincibility in particular positions, and so on,
it can be difficult to be absolutely sure what your move is going to do against them, forcing you to be very careful in particular situations, or just going for broke and hoping it works, and using that to learn whether or not it will. Generally, it's not in your favor when you're learning a game to hold back too much on a super because it might cause you to lose. Even online, where you generally want to keep on winning for various reasons, since you need to build up the skill at some point anyway in order to bypass wherever, you might as well build it as you go and take the occasional extra loss that it forces on you. One difference you've just seen is the fact that even if Ino pushes Slayer off with her green block, since Slayer's attack vectors involve an invincible moveset and an invincible dash, she can't just immediately hit something to try to keep out. But we're back to the grind of Ino having reactions and Faust throwing items.
ファッションには疎いのですが、露出が過ぎる。
Carrying over skills from other games to Guilty Gear is easier when you feel comfortable with the characters and the comparison between your character in said other game and this one. Knowing both where they are similar and where they are different can help you build a better mental model of how to approach matchups as well. It may, however, be harder to make this sort of decision about your opponent's characters. In other words, if you know matchup information from one game, you may not be able to transfer it over as easily without understanding what the opposing character is like. One way to look at this is to look at the style played by certain high-level players online who play multiple games and see which characters they end up choosing to play in others. But of course, note that this is not as simple as in game A they play X character, in game B they play Y character. It is very important to take into account both the current perceptions of tiers, especially in competitive games, and the player's style with the character and which game is their main game. Another good way to do it is to look for trends across characters who are played by multiple people and see if they line up in other games as well. If you were to find, for example, that every Johnny player in Guilty Gear who also played Street Fighter had all taken up Falk at the same time, then you should start to consider whether or not you can beat Falk in the same way that you beat Johnny. She may not, however, have the same weaknesses. This applies across all games. And you can also see what happens when the character in question does not have the weaknesses of the one you're familiar with. However, comparing characters by strengths can still be useful in many situations. because it can at least help you decide what not to try to do against them.
いい勝負でした。はい、勝ちだ。投資ではなく、
Similarly, if you gain the ability to check
支援もなく、
characters in this way,
することが可能なのか。
just looking at the similarities will sometimes help you understand how to play the matchup better, even if the next game does not tell you anything about weaknesses or anything like that. This is a backup for when you don't have training partners of a particular character or understanding of that character, but expect that you're going to be going to a tournament soon or something and need to be able to deal with it. Since relatively linear attack spaces mean that in the moment where he can no longer afford to try to predict Ino's direct location and hit her, i.e. he's either lost too much of the life lead or has been cornered for too long. This is the reason that he ends up using the blitz. In that situation shown there, Ino loses all of her attack vectors without Sin actually suffering that much, even if she does not actually do it. Therefore, he can safely use that meter to save himself from extremely complex or unfamiliar situations, rather than risk dying. This is partially because Ino is not generally standing close enough to instantly punish Sin heavily for it. And that being the main advantage shown there. Using Blitz to keep close range characters off you is more so effective when you expect the Blitz to absolutely work. But ending up too close to them as a result of it being blocked can often lead to a lot of damage. This is not so much the case with Ino, making it easier and often better for Sin to just do that. You can think of it as his uncertainty clause for this matchup. He has a lot of good options for getting around a ton of her things. And in terms of just pure trading of damage, often comes out on top, but there's always that moment where it's not clear what to do next. And in that moment, you hit your blitz and hope for the best, which is usually a good situation for you. It helps, of course, that when you see Ino go into a position you were not expecting, you can just jump over a lot of things. Or you can do the blitz quite quickly, since she shouldn't recover in time to get away from it. Whereas his other moves have a lot more uncertainty with covering that space in the time frame required, without her being able to get out of it somehow. This matchup, on the other hand, we all know well. We're back to, do I have enough meter to push you off me? And on the other side, should I keep on attacking now that you have enough meter to push me off you? There's not much else to this matchup in the straight sense, other than that Sin needs to stay out of the corner for as long as possible to prevent the situation of not having any meter to do that with in the first place. And Slayer mostly has to let Sin go there because pushing him back is relatively hard without putting yourself in that same situation as mentioned before. As Slayer will always have control space as long as his pressure is going. Even in the mid-screen, it's very difficult for Sin to respace himself without the faultless defense. However, if he happens to, he can usually wait that out because Slayer, in turn, generally should stop attacking. However, since Slayer always has the option of continuing to attack just because he feels that he can take advantage of the moment, you do have to at least consider whether or not you will risk being pushed all the way to the corner or pushed into an infinite pressure string by choosing to conserve your meter and not faultless defense. This matchup, again, known quite well. Very meter heavy and very spacing specific. Sin's position becomes more difficult as the match goes on though, because he will run out of calorie gauge without getting a lot of chances to refill it. Making it important to use meter to blitz the opponent off sometimes, as he's very unlikely to get a lot of options otherwise. There, however, if he does manage to read them and hit them with Beat Driver, he can usually use that time to refill. And if he fails, mostly he'll just end up blocking, and should already have enough meter to control that situation and still get the potential to eat.
perfectly cross-up mat. This is another match where, again, the uncertainty clause is basically to blitz. Giving you enough time to set up things and eat. As noted, since you can do so much damage off of any mistake from Baiken when you're fully fed. We are now, however, going into our last match of the night. And while this one isn't the customary closeout match, it is somewhat symbolic in this case. So, one domestic blizzard. This match tends to require Sin's direct use of meter for blitz and similar things much less, which is why you so often see Sin supers being used in it. However, similar to Baiken, often Sin must find some way to buy enough time to eat. And when the situation has gone relatively poorly, it's hard to get that time. Once he has it though, it works fairly easily. If you're not familiar with how his mechanic works, Sin's calorie gauge goes up to a set amount, and every move takes about 1/10 of that. The max is a 16th or so. The important thing is that he always refills to that same set amount no matter how low he was, as long as he was under it. So any opportunity you get to eat will give you another 10 moves worth, as long as you get to eat fully. When you are at that value and try to eat more, you can fill up, but it's not as great. Still, if you happen to get a really good hit, might as well. We are eventually going to see a reduction in Kai's effective pressure as our Sin player improves with the Hot Baker execution. But like most invincible wake-up reversal style things, it takes a little while to get used to it at first. Fortunately, it is also invincible for a whole 9 frames as mentioned before, so you tend to get away a little bit better when things go your way. That brings us to our usual 10 PM stop time, as this is an East Coast lounge. Join us tomorrow for Sandbag Casual Street Fighter V, on Thursday for Kame House Lobbies, Dragon Ball Fighters Beginners, and on Friday for something random, possibly Tekken. But most likely just literally random Tekken, not lounge or anything similar. With that said, therefore, this is Virillion for Team 2MK. Enjoy your evening and train hard, everyone.